Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Bongaarts.
Thank you very much, Janet, for that kind introduction. And good evening. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. One of the greatest achievements of modern society is the increase in longevity that has occurred over the last century and a half. We, that is the people living in the industrialist world, live much longer and healthier lives than our ancestors ever did. And this is, of course, a trend that we welcome and we like to see continue. So today I would like to take a look at what is likely to happen next and see how much further longevity can be increased in future decades. This question, of course, is being examined by a wide range of disciplines. We have molecular biologists looking at our DNA to find genes that are associated with aging in the hope of making biological changes that improve our longevity. At the other end of the spectrum are demographers like myself, demographers and epidemiologists, who study trends in death rates and in causes of death, both to explain what's happened and to describe what's happened. And then once we understand better past developments, we can make more accurate projections to the future. And projections are needed for a variety of purposes. For example, the Social Security Administration predicts that the Social Security Administration will move into deficit around the year 2040, and that projection is based on an assumption about how long we live between now and 2040. So let me now first outline what here is the outline of my talk. I'll begin with a look at the past and present trends in life expectancy in different countries and within countries, and looking back into history. And then I'll try to explain in a brief form the reasons why life expectancy has risen, looking at the broad range of determinants of mortality. The second half is about the future, and the first thing to say about the future is that we have strong disagreement about life ahead. Optimists think that longevity will increase rapidly for a long time to come, and pessimists believe that we're now very close to a biological limit. I'll then examine U.S. projections of life expectancy to the year 2050. And then I will conclude by trying to answer two questions. How long will we live, not only in years, but also how much of those years is spent in good health? And then finally, some of the things you may be able to do to prolong your life. So let's move then first to a look at the past. For some countries, we have detailed mortality statistics going back a long way. In the case of Sweden, it goes back to 1750, and to 750. And as you can see, let's see, my pointer is refusing to. Here we go. Life expectancy was around 35-40 years on average in the late 1700s. Okay, this thing is dying. Let me go to the... in the late 1700s, life expectancy was around 30 or 40 years. Now, life expectancy is the average age at death. So some newborns die very shortly after being born, and some people live to 70, 80, or 90. This is simply the average of that wide range of mortality. So in the 17th and 18th century, mortality was high, life expectancy in close to 30. Very little happened until the late 1800s, and then a very rapid increase until around 1950, 1960, and then the rapid, somewhat less rapid increases continue until today. Now, this trend is observed in other countries, and there's a broad set of facts behind them, which are fascinating, and I cannot go into detail tonight, but let me just show you the highlights. First, the slight increases occurring in the early 1800s is probably due to improvements in incomes and therefore nutrition, and with better nutrition one is better able to fend off infectious disease. Medicine in these days did very little to prolong your life. And that changed in the late 1800s when Louis Pasteur was one of the key people proving the germ theory of infection. And that led very quickly to vaccinations and so on, which prevented childhood disease, and child mortality declined, and very rapid increases in life expectancy in the early 1900s. That continued after the discovery of antibiotics, sulfa drugs, and penicillin and other antibiotics in the 30s and 40s. Continuing until the 1950s. By the 1950s, most infectious disease was under control, and the remaining improvements in life expectancy are now occurring as a result of treatment of heart disease, etc. What lies ahead is unclear, and I'll show you later details of that. Some people say that an anti-aging pill will eventually appear, but we'll see. That may appear, but that will be a long time off, I think. Here are additional statistics for other developed high-income countries. Those are mostly European countries. The red line is the United States, but you see the broad pattern is the same. Mortality around 40, life expectancy around 40, rapid increases until the 1950s, and then slightly slower increases in the recent decades. Notice that over time, these countries are converging. So there was wide variation over time in the 18th and early 19th century, and then today we're converging into a very narrow range. Now the U.S. line, as you see, is somewhere in the middle of the pack. It rose a little bit above average, but now the U.S. is actually almost last. And I'll come back to the explanation for that a little later in my talk. Here are the numbers for the year 2000. This is life expectancy for females and life expectancy for males. Japan is the leader. Female life expectancy is 84.6 in 2000, and now it's over 85, actually, recent data. This goes all the way down to the US is 79.5 and Denmark 79.1. So a range of about 5 years between the highest and lowest life expectancy in the most developed countries. The data for for males are somewhat lower. So again, Japan is the record holder of 77.7 years, and the US is dead last at 74.1. This looks like light variation, but it's compared to the rest of the world, this is a fairly narrow band. And here is a look at the rest of the world. These are data from the United Nations, estimates from 1950 to 2000, and then projections to the year 2050. The huge variation in life expectancy today and in recent decades. Japan became the record holder around 1970 and has stayed in the lead until today. The red line is North America, which actually was ahead of Japan and Europe in 1950s, but has fallen behind Japan. Europe in this graph includes Eastern Europe. So Western Europe is actually ahead of America. But Eastern Europe and Russia have low life expectancy, and that pulls the average for Europe down. And then the three bottom line are the developing world. Latin America, Asia have seen very rapid increases. China has been spectacular increase in life expectancy. And then the lowest level is found in Africa. In Africa and Asia in 1950, life expectancy was not different from what it was in Europe in 2 or 3 centuries ago. But Africa has also seen increases until around 1990. That leveled then off and actually saw a small decline, and that is of course the result of the AIDS epidemic. The AIDS epidemic appears to have peaked now, and the UN therefore expects further increases in the future in life expectancy. So we have substantial differences among countries. There are also important differences within countries. In every country, if you look at education, income, ethnic groups, they all differ in life expectancy. Here is an example of that, where in the United States we have the richest and the poorest 10 percentile of the population, data for 1981, 1990 and 1999. So in 1981, the poorest 10% had a life expectancy of 73, while the richest 10% had a life expectancy of nearly 76, so about a 3-year difference. Over time, all groups have seen their life expectancy increase, but the largest increases have occurred among the rich, reaching 79, while the poorest have seen only a modest increase. So over time, the difference in quality has risen. And this is not true in other countries, many other countries. So in summary, the trends I've shown you, we've seen large increases over time in most countries, large differences between countries, and large group differences within countries. So let me now turn to explain these findings and take a look at the determinants of mortality. Now, if you ask a doctor who has just attended a death, he will give you what is called a cause of death. That is a very specific medical term that goes on to the death record, death certificate. And the next slide shows the leading causes of deaths in the United States in 2005 and in 1900. Today, heart disease, cancer, and stroke account for substantially over half of all death. And this is a very different list from what it was in 1900, when pneumonia, influenza, TB, diarrhea, and enteritis were the leading causes of death. So over time, we have conquered infectious disease, and as infectious disease disappears, we end up with aging-related degenerative disease like these. Now, the composition of diseases, the causes of death, changes over time and continues to change over time. And this slide shows the trends for the United States from 1968 to 2000 for men and for women, for the 3 leading causes of death, so heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And what we see that is over these past 3 decades, heart disease mortality has declined very rapidly, about 50%. And this is because we have our doctors are better able to deal with heart disease, but also because risk factors are declining. We're exercising a bit more, we have less saturated fat in our diet, cholesterol is controlled, and high blood pressure is lower now than it was 3 decades ago. There's no big trend in cancer. In fact, cancer rose a little bit until around 1990, and the reason for that, a large part of the explanation for that is smoking, but it's now declining. So we're moving in the right direction in the last decade or so. And then stroke has roughly a similar trend to heart disease, very substantial declines in stroke. For women, the trends are essentially the same, declines in heart disease and stroke, but none in cancer. And women live longer than men, and therefore their death rates of all diseases are lower than for men. So these are the causes of death, but how then do we end up with a particular set of causes in a particular population? For an answer to that, we have to move further back in the causal chain and look at risk factors. Risk factors are biological, behavioral, and environmental factors that increase your chances of getting a disease. And it depends on interventions, the degree to which we can prevent disease or can cure it after it has occurred. So let me say a few more words about these risk factors. Here are a set of 4 risk factors. First, the environment, air, water, and foodborne disease. This has been the main environmental problem for most of history, but we now have cleaner environment. But this is the source of infectious disease. And then vectors such as mosquitoes for malaria and so on. Nutrition, undernutrition is still a major problem around the planet in poor populations. But in the richer parts of the world, obesity and poor diet are key causes of disease. And behavior, we have smoking, exercise, stress, and social interactions which affect our disease patterns. And then finally, genetic makeup. If you have parents who lived a long life, then your chances of living long have risen. Then on the intervention side, we have two broad categories. We have public health measures, clean water, sanitation, and vaccinations. These were very important over the last century in increasing life expectancy. And then, of course, modern medicine, which is drugs, surgery, and so on. Now, these factors in turn, if moving back further in the chain of causation, are a function of what I call background variables. So we have science, we have income, education. Science, of course, has driven the interventions, drugs, and so on. Science has also discovered that smoking was a major cause of lung cancer, caused risk factors decline, and people have reduced their smoking. Income is an important part now historically, income brought a cleaner environment, but income is still important in the poor countries of the world where simply there are not enough resources to buy medical care and interventions. So an explanation of the trends in life expectancy can involve explanation at all these levels. Increases in life expectancy over the last 2 centuries are due to the conquering of infectious disease. So we have less infectious disease and more degenerative disease. We have reduced risk factors. In particular, we have a cleaner environment now. We have more drugs. We have antibiotics, etc. And all of this is driven by scientific discovery, by higher incomes and more education. So this is the broad picture that one has to look at, and we can have explanations at different levels of trends in mortality. All right, that's all I want to say about the past. Let me now turn to the future and what we can say about trends in life expectancy. As I mentioned, there is strong disagreement about what lies ahead. And I divide them into 2 camps, calling them optimist and pessimist. So here is the past trend of all the high-income countries and very large increases. The optimists believe that this trend will continue and will end up with life expectancy of 100 years or so later in this century. And the pessimists believe that this is as good as it gets and we're very close to a maximum. Let me explain these views a little more detail. The pessimists basically say there's a biological upper limit to life, and that's about 85 years, a little higher for women than for men. They claim that past increases in life expectancy are due to the control of infectious disease. So there's no problem saying we have had a large increase and therefore we must have future increases. They say it's just infectious disease and that's a one-off factor. We cannot benefit from further declines in infectious disease because they're essentially gone in the rich countries. And then they claim that aging-related mortality is biologically fixed. Basically, they say that the aging process is one that is fixed by nature because nature really doesn't care about people living past their reproductive ages. So the natural selection operates to keep you alive until you have reproduced. And then you can live somewhat longer, but it's like a car that's beyond warranty. The car runs until the warranty is out, and then things start falling apart. You can keep it running for a while, but they say that this is a hopeless task to fix this. The optimists say, well, look, we have had enormous improvements in life expectancy, and we'll find something will happen to keep it going. They claim that aging-related mortality has declined in recent decades. And they also point to various experiments that have been done with animals, longevity prolonging experiments, including genetic manipulations of worms, fruit flies, rats, mice and rats, and now of primates. And these point to our ability to actually increase longevity. So who's right? Well, it's hard to say, but there are actually some facts we can check. And specifically, we can look at the claims which are contradictory. the trend in aging-related mortality is fixed, the pessimists say, and the optimist says the aging-related mortality has declined. So let's take a look at that particular claim and see who has it right. So to do that, I divide mortality into two components. The aging-related component, also called senescent mortality, is heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And the non-aging-related mortality is most infectious diseases and violent deaths like accidents, murder, and so on. And I have a procedure which I won't describe for dividing mortality in these components, but here is a trend in death rate for Swedish females from 1850 to today. And the top line gives the mortality of all causes, which is very high and fluctuating in the late 1800s, very rapid declines, which continues to today. But if you now look at the aging-related deaths, we see only a very modest trend, or really fairly constant. And then around 1950, it began to decline more rapidly. And half of mortality in the 1850s was due to infectious disease and violence, and the other half due to aging-related death. Over time, the component due to infectious disease declined, and it became almost insignificant by the 1950s. So this can be turned into estimates of life expectancy. And here is an average of half a dozen advanced countries. First, life expectancy at birth, which is attributable to all causes of death. As I said earlier, it started around 40 and has increased and leveled off a little bit to today. If I remove from the calculation of life expectancy infectious disease and violence, I get what I call aging-related life expectancy. This is the average years of life that you can expect in the absence of infectious disease and violence. And surprisingly, you find that in 1850, that was near 70. So, and it hasn't changed very much. So old age mortality didn't change very much until 1950, and then it started increasing. So if we zero in on this part of the curve, which really is most important, we get this trend. And this is aging-related life expectancy from 1950 now to 2000. This is for females and for males. And we see a nice steady increase for females from about 75 to 81 or so. Males have seen a rapid increase in this aging indicator from 1970 to 2000, but there was a pause here between 1950 and 1970. And the explanation for this pause, I will give you further details in a moment, is smoking. Okay, so let's first summarize what these data tell us about the pessimists and the optimists. So the pessimists are correct to claim that most of past improvements in life expectancy were due to decline in infectious disease and violent deaths. There's no question that most of the improvement, in fact, was due to that. The optimists are correct to claim that aging-related mortality is declining rapidly today. Aging-related mortality didn't change very much until the 1950s or 1960s, but it is changing rapidly now. The optimists are wrong not to recognize the important role of infectious disease. The pessimists are wrong in not recognizing that aging-related mortality is changing now. And altogether, I think there's no evidence of biological limits to life expectancy. So my projection, which I'll show you in a moment, is somewhere between the pessimists and the optimists. Now let's come back to this puzzle of the males who are not improving very much in the 50s and 60s. And this is due to the impact of smoking. So let me say a few words about smoking mortality. This is a trend in the percent of all U.S. deaths due to smoking. The yellow line is males and the red line is females from 1950 to today. So in 1950, about 8% of all deaths of males was due to smoking. That increased to 25% in the 1980s. A quarter of all male deaths were due to smoking. That number is now declining, and the reason it's declining is that smoking declined in the 1960s after it was discovered that smoking was a major cause of death. Now, female mortality from smoking is lower, but it has risen rapidly in the 70s and 80s, and now it's approaching the male mortality. And this is because women didn't start smoking until much later than men, and they have smoked less. Now, the trend here looks like, and in fact, recent data I just saw last week, and I didn't include in this slide, is that, in fact, female smoking mortality is declining now. So this has just turned the corner. Now, what is the impact of this smoking on life expectancy? I've tried to calculate that, and let me first talk about the females. The red line is the observed life expectancy with smoking, and the green line is what you would get without smoking. So the difference between this line is zero because in 1950, because there was very little smoking mortality among females, but it has widened over time, and the impact now is about 2 years. So I expect that this gap will narrow over time, and that the green line will continue, while the red line then merges with the green line. For males, we had this pause, and that if you remove smoking effect, which is about 2 years, 2.5 years, then you get a much more straight line. The effect is not entirely removed, in part because the impact of mortality may be underestimated somewhat. But the bottom line is that if you remove smoking, then we see both male and female life expectancy, aging life expectancy, decreasing at a quite rapid clip. This is the US data, and I have done similar calculations for other countries, the other 16 countries. The top white lines are for females, and the bottom lines are for males. And you see, again, pretty nice straight declines at an average rate of about 1.5 years per decade. And I think this is the pace at which life expectancy is likely to continue in the future. So roughly 1.5 years, that's about 15 years per century. That's not a huge increase, but it's certainly not a stop. Now note also that the red line here, which is the United States, we're sort of in the middle of the pack here. And the information I've given you now can now be used to identify some of the factors that are responsible for why the U.S. is different from other developed countries. So here's a calculation for females. The red line gives the average life expectancy for the 16 high-income countries, and that is 81.5 years. This is the U.S. For females, life expectancy is 79.5, and a difference of 2 years. So why is that? Well, first, if we remove the effect of infectious disease, actually there's very little infectious disease, but violence, we have more violence, more accidents, murders, and so on in this country than in Europe and Japan. And if you remove that factor, that accounts for about half a year in this comparison. But a farther largest reason why U.S. females' life expectancy is lower than in other countries is smoking. U.S. females smoke much more than their counterparts in Japan and Europe. So if you remove smoking and infectious disease, then U.S. life expectancy is very similar to that of other countries. And you'd expect that. We have an expensive healthcare system. Our healthcare in this country is good. But smoking has a huge impact on life expectancy. Okay, so my conclusions are smoking impact is large, but it is peaked. So people can change their behavior. Smoking is coming down, and that mortality will decline. And that, in turn, will increase the pace at which life expectancy rises. The U.S. aging-related life expectancy without smoking is very close to that of leading other developing countries. So life expectancy with smoking, we're lower, but without smoking, we're not very different from the rest of the world, leading world. And then finally, aging-related life expectancy rose at a pace of about 1.5 years per decade between 1950 and 2000, and I see no reason why it couldn't continue to rise at this pace. All right. What does all this apply now for U.S. life expectancy? And there are a lot of people who have made projections, and I've summarized them in this slide. This first part of the curve just shows what we have observed. These are estimates of past. And then there are a range of projections made by different organizations and researchers. The bottom line is the Social Security Administration. The middle pack is the Census Bureau and two sets of researchers, Lee and myself. And then Uppen and Vopel are the super optimists. So the Social Security has a fairly pessimistic projection. This goes from about 76 to about 81. The Census Bureau thinks that we'll end up around 85. And the optimists say it will be at 90 in the year 2050. So we have a wide range of outcomes, and it's hard to say who's right. Any one of them could be right, frankly. But let me give you one other piece of information that may help narrow this. I have added to this graph the level of life expectancy in Japan in the year 2005. So Japan's life expectancy in 2005 is about 82. Now, if the Social Security Administration is right about its projection, that means that U.S. life expectancy does not catch up with current Japanese life expectancy until the year 2060 or 2070. And that seems a little implausible to me. So I think the Social Security Administration is a little bit conservative, and that has, of course, implications for the solvency of that organization. Since my name is there, I think this is roughly right. So I think the Census Bureau has got it about right, and Uppen and Vopel are probably dreamers, but who knows? Now, so why is the Social Security Administration lower? There's three factors here, I think. First of all, they don't think that life expectancy can continue, so they assume that future improvements are slower than in the past, and I'm not sure why that would be, but that's what they do. Secondly, they don't explicitly account for the distortion caused by smoking. So in the U.S., for females, for example, we've seen a slowdown in life expectancy improvements because of smoking. But smoking is turned around now, so once smoking is gone, that distortion goes away and life expectancy should resume at a faster pace. And the Social Security Administration doesn't explicitly account for that. And then international experience suggests strong convergence to higher life expectancy levels. If you remember the first slide I showed, there was a wide variation between countries, and we're coming down to a very narrow range. I think that will continue. Medical innovations quickly spread around the world. And if the Social Security Administration is correct, then the U.S. would be an outlier. It's possible, but I think that is not all that likely. So let me turn. That's all I want to say about the topic of how long we live. Let me now say a word about what happens if we live longer. If you live longer, are these healthy years, or are these years added but living inactive or in poor health? And again, here we have the optimist versus the pessimist. The pessimists say, yes, life expectancy is rising. This is in the past from 1950 to 2000. So the red line gives life expectancy totally. But they say healthy life expectancy has not improved. So basically what they believe is that modern medicine keeps sick people longer alive. So you increase the number of disabled years, but not the healthy active years. The optimists have a different view. They say life expectancy is rising, but healthy and active life expectancy is also rising. So they think that the disabled years have not increased. It's actually not that easy to find data, but here's one study which basically argues with the optimist. This is a study by Manton from U.S. data from the 60s, 70s, and late 90s. Life expectancy rose, but healthy and active life expectancy also rose. So in this study of the U.S., there is no increase in disabled years over time. And this finding is consistent with what people report in surveys about their own well-being. This shows the self-reported health of people over 65. In separate surveys starting in 1982, people were asked how they feel. And they could answer excellent, very good, good, poor, and fair. So starting from 1982, the proportion that say excellent to very good has gone up, and the people who say they're feeling fair or poor has gone down. So our lives are getting longer, but we also are healthier longer, and we're feeling healthier. So all of these facts are consistent. Finally, now all this boring stuff, I come to the answer to why you're here. What can you do to live longer? Well, before I get to what we can do, I should point out that raising life expectancy is straightforward for much of mankind. And so first to look at the developing world. 2.6 billion people live in poverty. They have low life expectancy, high child mortality. In some parts of Africa, a third of children die in childhood. There's widespread under and malnutrition. In India, 40% of infants are malnourished. There's a lack of clean water and sanitation. Many drugs that we take for granted are simply unaffordable to people. And few doctors, clinics, nurses, etc., and hospitals. So this is largely a problem of lack of resources. This is not a scientific problem. This is a problem of resources. Foreign aid can help with this. And also governments. Governments should invest in health more than in, say, the military. That's a problem in many countries. Now coming back to a problem for the developed world, it's not so obvious what we can do. If you look back at our scheme for the determinants of mortality, we know that the causes of death now are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Ideally, we would like a pill to get rid of cancer. We'd like to have a pill to live longer, but they don't exist yet. And so we need science, investments in science to help us find new inventions. Unfortunately, those are slow, and that may take decades before we have a solution for all of our causes of death. In the meantime, what we can work on is risk factors. So let me now give you some of the evidence that we have why lifestyle changes or behavior changes can really make a difference. First, a look at the effects of smoking and exercise. Now, this looks like a crowded slide, so let me take one step at a time. This is life expectancy, the number of years you can expect to live at age 65. Men on the left, women on the right. This group of men is divided into never smokers and former smokers. Let's call them never smokers and smokers, and women never smokers and smokers. There are 3 bars here. This is low exercise, level of physical activity, low exercise, moderate exercise, and high exercise. So let's take a look at the men who never smoked. Those who have low physical exercise live on average another 13 or 14 years. Let's call it 13 years. If you go then to the group that's moderate exercise, they live about 3 years longer. This is about 17 years. For those who have a high physical activity, it's about 18 or 19 years. So the effect of exercise is to raise your life expectancy at age 65 by about 4 years. That's a substantial amount. Now, if you compare, just as an aside, the red part of this graph is the year spent disabled, and the blue part is the active life expectancy, but I won't emphasize that for now. Basically, exercise is good for you. Now, if you compare these 3 bars with the next 3 bars, these are smokers. You see, all these bars are substantially shorter than these bars, and that is because smoking takes several years away from your life, about 4 or 5 years. The other effect here is that exercise doesn't help smokers very much. If you don't smoke, exercise helps a lot. If you smoke, exercise doesn't help that much. Now, for women, the story is exactly the same. Exercise helps, but generally women live longer by several years. And smoking cuts your life. So the message here is don't smoke and exercise. This figure summarizes the effect of obesity on the risk of mortality. Obesity is measured by the body mass index, or BMI, and that's plotted along this axis. Thin people are over here, obese people are over here. There's 3 graphs here, one for ages 25 to 59, one for 60 to 69, and 70 and over. So let's look at this age group first. What we see here is an inverse pattern, a U-shaped pattern, with people around with a BMI, this is a normal weight, at a low point. If you're very thin, you have an elevated risk of mortality, about 40% higher. And if you're obese, very obese, your risk is almost twice as high as average. This is for this age group. If you look at the next age group, we say again a U-shaped pattern. The thinnest people have a high risk. Obese people also have a high risk, slightly lower than the younger group. And if you go to the 70 and over group, the U-shaped pattern is almost changed. Having low weight is again risky. Being obese is no longer a significant problem. So if you're over 70, you can go to McDonald's, yeah. So beginning to recognize that obesity is primarily a problem among these age groups. Now, the other fact is that people who are very thin have higher mortality. And that is almost certainly because these are sick people. In other words, and this study didn't control for thickness. All right, the next slide, again, is a bit complicated. This looks at diet and blood pressure. Now, the effects of diet on mortality and risk factors is difficult to measure because people don't like being on a diet. If you take 100 people and say, you 50 eat a very salty, very sugary diet, people are not going to inherit. And if you take another group and you say, you eat no salt and no sugar, those people will sometimes make a mistake and go to McDonald's. But rats don't have that problem. So here are some experiments with rats. And the results are, there are 8 groups of rats. 2 groups, a group that has a diet of complex carbohydrates, about 60% of their calories came from complex carbohydrates, a high-fat diet, a high fructose diet, and a Western diet, which is primarily fat and fructose. And all groups had enough protein to be reasonably healthy. Then the black bar is the onset of the experiment. The hatched bar is 5 weeks into the experiment, and the white bar is 10 days, 5 weeks and 10 weeks. So this is the trend over time. And then there's 2 groups here for each. This is the plain diet, and this is the plain diet with salt. So this is a salt group, that's a salt group, that's a salt group, and that's a salt group. So let's take a look at what happened here. First, people who had complex carbohydrates. Since normal chow for rats is already a starchy diet, very little happened. These rats were put on carbohydrates, and very little happened to their blood pressure. Then salt was added to their diet. So this is the beginning of the experiment, and 5 weeks later, their blood pressure almost doubled. So a very large increase in blood pressure as a result of the addition of salt. Let's now look at the fat group. And this group, first let's look at the experiment without salt. At the onset, they were the same as all groups. All the black bars, as you can see, are the same, and this is the beginning of the experiment. Then fat was added, and you get a jump in the blood pressure, although not as high as with salt, but still a very substantial increase in blood pressure. And then adding salt to the fat increased blood pressure even more. Same story here for fructose. This is without fructose. This is with fructose. Very large increases in blood pressure. Adding salt to the fructose is even higher blood pressure. And then finally, Western diet, again, very high blood pressures. So the message is clear. Fat, fructose, and salt raise blood pressure, and that is a high risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, here's my favorite slide. This is alcohol intake and the risk of mortality. This topic has been contentious, but here is a summary of about 30 different experiments. What we have here is the relative risk of mortality set at 1 for people who have 0 drinks per day. So along this axis is the number of drinks per day. 0 drinks, 1, 2, 3, 4 drinks per day. And this is the mortality pattern you get. So let's start with women. This central line here is the average for women, and these two other lines are the confidence intervals around it. So women who have don't drink, have a relative risk of 1. Then mortality drops rapidly when you get to about half a drink per day for women. The benefit stays until roughly 2 or 3 drinks for women, and then you're in trouble. So now men can handle a little bit more alcohol. So the male pattern is again a very sharp drop when you go from 0 to 1 or 2 drinks. And then by the time you get to 4 drinks, the benefit is gone, and then mortality rises. So, you have to also realize you cannot average out. That it means you cannot drink nothing for 6 days and then get drunk the 7th day. That is not what this is for. So you have to do this every day religiously. And then finally, a discovery that is actually interesting and relatively recent. Your risk of death depends on how socially connected you are. So here are results for men and women. And women and women are asked how many ties they have to friends or family. So the red bar are men who live alone, have no friends and no family. The yellow bar is men who have a wife or a friend. And this is 2 and 3 and 4 ties. So you can see the mortality drastically declines the more interaction you have. The same is true for women, but apparently women are more resilient than men. So even women who are alone have a lower mortality risk than men who live alone. But even here, there is a clear benefit of being socially connected. All right, this brings me to the end of my talk. So my conclusion is that we're going to live longer, but don't wait for the pills to help you. You're going to have to help yourself. So my advice is to don't smoke, exercise, eat healthy diet, limit sugar, salt, and saturated fat, avoid obesity unless you're over 70. Control blood pressure, cholesterol, go to the doctor every year and control it. Be socially active, have 1 or 2 drinks per day, and avoid stress. Now, one final, some of you say, well, there's a lot of trouble. And it is, but there are big benefits. The best estimate we have of the increase in life expectancy, if people do all of this, is 10 to 20 years. Okay, and we know that from people like religious groups, priests and nuns who have roughly followed these guidelines, and they live into their 90s and close to 100 on average. So you really can make a difference if you follow most of this advice. Thank you very much.